The Torah was written economically. Every word has some meaning. There are no superfluous words, certainly not superfluous sentences. And because of that, it raises the question why the Torah does sometimes repeat itself. And one glaring example is the commandment in this week's Torah portion, entitled Rabbi, of not cooking a kid in the milk of its mother, which means not to take a young animal and cook it in the milk of its mother. This commandment appears 3 times in the Torah. The first time it appears is in the book of Exodus, in the Parsha of Mishpatim. That's the Parsha that deals with civil and criminal law mostly. That's the very next section after the Torah talks about the giving of the 10 Commandments. So that's where it's mentioned for the first time. Don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. Then a few parshas later, Parshas Kisisa, where it talks about the golden calf. And it continues with the instructions about building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary in the desert. In that context, the Torah again repeats the commandment, don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. And now, in Deuteronomy, in this parsha, the Torah repeats itself again. Don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. Why does the Torah repeat itself? So the Talmud tells us that, in fact, there were 3 separate prohibitions. Even though they're phrased identically, the oral tradition, which is the tradition that was given over to Moses at Mount Sinai, that really explains what the written text is all about. That oral tradition tells us that the 3 commandments, don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother, refers to 3 separate prohibitions. Number 1, you're not allowed to cook meat and milk. The cooking itself, person cannot get a job in a restaurant where they have meat and milk cooked together. Well, if it's not kosher meat, it might be a little bit different kind of a prohibition, but we won't go into those technicalities right now. You cannot cook milk and meat, even if you don't eat it. The second prohibition is to tell you that not only are you not allowed to cook it, you're not allowed to eat it even if someone else cooked it. You can't eat it. The third prohibition goes a step further. Not only you can't eat it, you can't derive any benefit from it. For example, you can't sell it. If somehow you own a mixture of milk and meat and you want to get rid of it and someone is willing to pay you for it, you can't take any money for it. You have to discard it. You have to destroy it. You can't feed it to your dog. Your dog doesn't have to be kosher, but it can't eat milk and meat, not because the dog can't eat it, but because we will then be benefiting from it, that we saved ourselves a meal that we normally have to give our pet. Now we gave him the milk and meat. You're benefiting from it, that's outlawed. You can't do that. Everything in the Torah has to teach us a lesson, not just the law itself, but also a lesson in terms of our own spirituality, in terms of our own relationship with God. What can we learn from these 3 prohibitions? Especially when the Torah could have just said explicitly, don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother, eat it, and derive benefit from it. 1 sentence. Instead, it has to give it to us in 3 sentences, scattered, interspersed in 3 different places of the Torah. And it's also important to know the context in which each of these 3 things are mentioned. One suggestion is based on a Mishnah, the saying of our sages in Ethics of the Fathers. Akavya ben Mahalalel Omer, Akavya, the son of Mahalalel, says, Histakel b'shlosha dvarim, reflect upon 3 things, ve'ein ata ba lidei avera, and you will not come to sin. And then it lists 3 things about where we come from, where we're going, and before whom we will be judged. The Rabbi once asked a very simple question. Anyone could count. He lists 3 things that we have to reflect on. So why does he have to give the introduction, reflect on three things? He should just say, reflect on where we come from, where we're going, and before whom we will be judged. Why does he have to preface that with the statement, there are three things that we have to reflect on? The Talmud asks similar questions in many places when the Mishnah, the earliest source, will list a few things, and it preface that with, there are three things, there are five things, whatever number there may be. It's unnecessary. So the Rebbe says, no. The first thing that we have to reflect on is that there are three things, that all of life revolves around three entities, three aspects of life. Everything is included within that. Because many people will only focus on one or two of the three. No, you have to focus on all three if you want to be prevented from transgression, from going in the wrong path. The word for sin here, avera, could be translated as going, deviating, straying, going over to another place where you don't belong. If you want to go on the straight path, then you need to know three things. What are the three things? God. Judaism is a God-centric religion. People who sometimes are afraid to mention the word God because they're afraid of being accused of being primitive, of being old-fashioned and superstitious. God is the greatest reality, the only true reality, and our lives have to revolve around God and our relationship with God. But it's not just about God, it's about us. We have to think about ourselves, our status, our place in the cosmos, our relationship with God. The focus has to be on ourselves as well. But there's a third thing, the rest of the world. We're not just here to cement our relationship with God, as great and as important as that is, and to make God closer to us, to perfect ourselves, to ennoble ourselves. That's all fine and great. But there's also a big world out there. Our obligation is to make that world a godly world. In the words of the Midrash, the famous words that are quoted countless times in Hasidic literature, why did God create this universe? He desired to have a dwelling place in the lowest or the lowliest of domains, which is this physical, material world. This is the lowest realm of existence. There are many levels of spirituality above and beyond us. This is the lowest level of existence. And that's where God says, I want you to bring my presence in every nook and cranny of this world. And how do we do that? Obviously, we do it by fulfilling the mitzvot, the commandments, by studying Torah. We generate godly energy into every part of the world. In the aggregate, when we do enough of that and we fill the world with that divine knowledge and divine presence, we bring about the Messianic age. So we have three different focuses. Sometimes we focus on God. Sometimes we focus on ourselves. Sometimes we focus on our mission to transform the world. So let's now take the three prohibitions which are mentioned in the Torah about milk and meat, the mixture of milk and meat. Let's start off with Mishpatim, the first time it appears in the section of the Torah that deals with Mishpatim. Mishpatim are civil and criminal laws, the laws that govern a just and civilized society, the laws against theft, the laws against murder, the laws against swearing falsely. These are the laws that are contained within that section of Mishpatim. In other words, even right after God gives us the Torah, greatest spiritual experience that ever occurred, people were exposed to God's presence in a way that was unprecedented and unparalleled. The Torah immediately follows that with, you know what? It's not just about relationship with God on a spiritual level. God wants you to make the world a civilized place, a place that is infused, suffused with spirituality, with kindness, with goodness, with love, with godliness. Focus on the world, not just on God and yourself. Sure, God is important in this role. We want to bring God to the world, but focus on the needs of the world. In that context, the Torah says, don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. Now, why do we fulfill that commandment? not to eat or cook milk and meat or eat or derive benefit. There are many reasons given. Of course, the ultimate reason is because it's a commandment. God said so. But nevertheless, our sages did give reasons that help us learn how to become a better person, how to become more godly. One reason is given that cooking an animal, a young animal, destroying the young animal in the milk of its mother is the height of cruelty. It's just so insensitive by using the mother, the nurturer, to destroy its own offspring, using its own milk that is used for nurturing. In other words, the Torah wants us to develop sensitivity to the world, to the creatures of the world, even animals. How much more so to other human beings? How much, and included in that is respect for the environment, respect for the whole world. That's the context in which that commandment appears. The Chinuch, one of the early commentators who gives the rationale for the 613 commandments, gives another reason. He says that God wants us to control our use of the forces of the world and not mix up different forces. Milk and meat represent different forces of nature, and we're not supposed to manipulate them. We have limits. God puts us in this world to be his partner in making the world a better place, and we have to sometimes alter nature, but God says there are limits. You're not God. You're God's partner. I'm giving you the partnership, but there are conditions, how far you can go. There's a respect for the natural world that is the focus of Mishpatim. And in that natural world, God wants us to make it a dwelling place for God by respecting the world and bringing holiness into it. Then we have the second context, the parsha of Kisisa. What is Kisisa about? First of all, the word Kisisa is translated as counting, when you count the people. But the word Sisa means elevate. When you elevate the people, you bring them to a higher level. The focus here is on God. And it's in the context, in the aftermath of the sin of the golden calf, which was the antithesis of what God said at Mount Sinai. I am the God, your God. Don't have any other gods in my presence. And here, what do? They worship another God. So the context here is our relationship with God. The focus is on God, that there is one God, and we may not compromise that with any form of idol worship, overt or sometimes subtle forms of idol worship. The focus has to be on God. And in that context, the Torah says, don't cook a kid in the milk of its mother. That doing this harms our relationship with God. God wants us to respect his laws and realize that the only way we can have a relationship with him is by fulfilling the commandments. So the context there is a context of focus on God. And that's why in that same section it talks about the construction of the Mishkan. What was the Mishkan? The tabernacle, the portable sanctuary in the desert. It was the place, as did the temple later on, where God's presence was felt, where you had a relationship, an overt, a very strong, clear relationship with God. Don't mess up that relationship with doing things that are contrary to God. Now, there's another reason given for this prohibition by Maimonides in his Guide for the Perplexed. Cooking milk and meat together was a pagan rite. The pagans did this. And the Torah wants us to distance ourselves from everything that is associated with idol worship and paganism. And therefore the Torah says, don't have anything to do with mixtures of milk and meat. Don't eat the milk and meat, because that way you will find some kind of connection to idolatry. You'll have something in common with idol worshipers. The Torah wants us to distance ourselves as much as possible, because that gets in the way of our relationship with God, where the focus is on God. That's the second mention of the commandment of not consuming milk and meat. Then we have the third commandment in this week's Torah portion, where the Torah speaks about all the general dietary laws, and then concludes, Banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. You are children to God your God. Don't gash yourselves. Don't inflict injury on yourself, which the Torah is trying to tell us that we are a special people. We are a holy people. As Rashi points out, we shouldn't gash ourselves because we are God's children and we are princes. We are royalty, and royalty should not be doing things to mutilate itself. So here the focus is not on God, although you have to have God in this discussion anyhow. It's not on the rest of the world. It's about us. It's about how we have to behave so that we are royalty, that we are special, that we express our status as children of God. And that's the context in which the commandment appears in this week's Torah portion. The focus is on us becoming holy people, a people that are special, a people whose behavior is expressive of our special relationship that we have. So that's why the Torah divides it into in three contexts, to tell us that this commandment, the keeping kosher in general, but especially keeping this mitzvah of separating milk and meat, the rabbis went to extremes in this regard, and they said not only should you not eat milk and meat that was cooked together, even if it wasn't cooked together, you shouldn't eat meat and then drink a glass of milk. You wait 6 hours. Some customs have shorter periods of waiting, but you have to wait extensively between meat and milk. Don't mix it in any form, in any shape. The rabbi said not only meat, but even fowl we shouldn't eat with milk, with dairy. Why did the rabbis feel that they have to add on more prohibitions? Because these three commandments represent the essence of what all of life and all of Judaism is about. It's about God, it's about the world and ourselves. And the whole Messianic era, which is the ultimate goal of existence, will be an era in which we will see the fulfillment of all three. God's presence will be fully revealed in the world. The world will be receptive to it. The world will be an elevated world. It'll be a physical world, but an elevated physical world. And we will realize our own special royal status. We will be truly expressive and aware of that we are God's children and we are capable of reaching the greatest heights.